Okay, the Vortex is all done and ready to fly. I'm just doing some final tweaks on the radio program. In fact, I just used my Snipe DLG program as a base template, and then just added a fifth channel for the motor and set that up like my F5J planes with a separate launch flight mode, and then just an on-off switch to make the motor run. So I may put that on a continuous controller at some point. We'll see how the F5K contest flying really works out as far as the motor. Let's look at our target weight. I have it on the CG scale here. And this is with the 300 pack, the smaller pack. This is as light as I can get this airplane. 264 grams, that's really excellent. And CG at 67. So that's pretty perfect. Like when I was building this plane, I really wasn't trying to save every little microgram like some guys do. I was able to save a couple of grams using some really lightweight servo wire for the extra leads I had to make for the fuselage. But there's really not that many places to shave weight on this airplane. So if you're using the same gear I'm using, anyone building this plane is going to be able to hit that really low target weight. Now you add the 550 pack, you add 9 grams on that, which is nothing. So I'm really happy with the weight. I mean, this thing feels like there's nothing in it. So it's going to fly really, really nice. Now I'm going to show you some details of the build. I'm not going to show you every excruciating detail of how I set up the spring pull system, things like that, but just kind of give you a guide on how I did things. There's a couple of different ways to put the gear in. I have the receiver pretty far back. Some guys could put the receiver further forward. There are definitely some choices here. I'm going to show you how I set up the firewall, the flaperon system, which was a little tricky, but I think my solution is working really nice. It's super tight. I get plenty of flap travel. So let's check out the Vortex 3 Electro details. So let's take a quick tour of the front of the fuselage here. It was pretty easy to build out. I've got the spinner here. I do have some black rubber bands on here, which pull the blades back. So when the motor's off, the blades snap back against the fuse, and you don't want to have that hanging prop syndrome. So let's pull the hatch back and take a look on the inside here. Now with the shaft extender on the motor, the can is a little farther back, so it's completely clear of the motor wires because the can rotates, so you have to clear those wires on the bottom. But we've got plenty of airspace around the motor. We should have good cooling as well. Here's the servo tray. This is the stock one that came with the kit, and these are the MKS 75 HVs mounted in there. And you can see I've got the tray mounted as far forward as I can. So there's a little bit of gap between the motor and the tray, but not much. Again, that's for CG issues. For wiring here, we just have the 2 wires running back to the receiver for the servos. This is the power connector for the LiPo. The LiPo slips inside here. Just goes inside here, and you can adjust that battery pack for CG. And then the pigtail. And the Talon ESC is actually sitting right underneath the servos. That thing is so small and so narrow and thin that there's actually quite a bit of air gap between the bottom of the servos and the ESC, and I just tack glued the ESC to the bottom of the fuse so it doesn't wiggle around, and it's wired directly to the motor as we saw in the parts when I showed you all the parts that were going in this plane here. So this build out's pretty straightforward. I've got the cables, of course, for the pull, the torsion spring system for, this is the rudder side and this is the elevator. So pretty easy build out for the front. I just kept everything as clean as possible. There's no extra wire, and anyone could do this install. This is the line that controls the ESC from the receiver. I have it set up as a pigtail here. So for regular flying, I just leave that connected. But if I want to splice in my altitude controller, like this is the Altus V4, I can just plug that in line here, and this plane becomes an F5K legal contest plane. Here's the elevator servo on this side, and here's the rudder. You can see I have the horn shortened way down because I want the cable to be very close to the inside of the axle center point to maximize resolution. That's kind of the key to really good elevator feel on these planes. Here's the rudder, a little bit more throw available. So here's elevator, and here's rudder. Now to attach the hatch to the fuse, I just went old school using a spring clip system here. These are pieces of carbon rod. You could use music wire as well, and they're just CA'd down with a patch of, this is spread to carbon, but you could use glass as well, and it just attaches firmly the spring clips into place. So these just slide underneath the lip of the canopy, slide it back and then slide it forward, and the front spring clips into the front edge of the fuse. So here's the middle of the fuselage. You're going to have to open up part of this bay at least because you need to pass through the flaperon servo connections. And I'll show you how they hook up to the wing at some point. I decided to open the second bay as well. You'd think, well, you're going to weaken the fuselage a lot, but this fuselage is so stout that when I opened up both bays, I couldn't tell the difference as far as stiffness, especially when you have the wing bolted on and cranked down. It's going to be completely strong. I just wanted to put the receiver back here because it cleans up a lot of the wiring, gets it out of the way, helps with my CG positioning. I also wanted to get the 2.4 antennas in the back here because this is an all-carbon airplane. Get them far back in the tail area. For hand catching, it's nice to have them out of the way, and also the wing will not block the signal too, because remember, this is an all-carbon airplane and reception is at a premium. So that's my solution for the midsection of the plane. So here's a detail of my antenna layout. They exit through the fuselage. They're well behind the trailing edge of the wing. They're at 90 degrees to each other. I have them mounted up on the fuselage a bit, so if you land this on the dirt or something, they're not going to get scraped up. But this configuration will give you an optimal signal path between your transmitter and your receiver. Here's a detail of the firewall. I just went old school and used some plywood. A firewall is not included with the kit at this time. Hopefully someone will make an aluminum one, like a CNC aluminum one, you can just drop in. That makes things a lot easier. I just used 2 screws to hold the motor in. That's all you really need. Definitely have Loctite on those. I made the firewall at 30 millimeters using a pattern initially, and then just carved it down to make it to fit. Now I did not use any up or down thrust, and there's no left or right thrust either. I set it at 0, to the wing. Now, one thing you absolutely have to do when installing the torsion spring is you need to put a piece of tubing to support the wire. This is some old Teflon push rod tubing from an old DLG push rod setup, and I used that. You can get a little bit creative. You can create a pocket with some epoxy, and there's a couple of ways to do that. Because you need to spread the load. If you just put the wire in through the foam here, there's so much torsion, twisting motion on that wire that's going to just pop right through the thin spread toe skin of both either the rudder or the elevator here. So you put the tubing in, CA that in place, and then you insert the wire into the tubing, and that little piece of tubing spreads the load out and keeps it from popping through the surface. You absolutely have to do that for the elevator and the rudder. So for the rudder, I put the torsion spring here, a little higher up above the horn, and it runs down to just above the horn at this point here. That could be a little higher up, doesn't really matter that much. You just don't want to put it all the way on the bottom here because you kind of want the load to be distributed up the hinge line a little bit. Again, you have to use those tubes to insert here, otherwise the ends of the wires are just going to poke right through the skin of the rudder. So here's the cable connection to the elevator horn. You can see how it just hooks in. One trick is to put a safety line. You can see that black thread there that's hooked through the loop and then glued just to the outside of the pylon there. So if you're taking the stab on and off a lot, it's pretty easy to lose that cable back down the fuselage and you'll have to refish it. But with a little safety line, you just pull the thread out and hook it back up. So here's the hookup for the rudder. Pretty straightforward. You just slot the horn in. The only thing you want to be careful of is just make sure you get a nice fair lead of the cable going into the pylon, because it does go into the pylon through the same hole that the elevator cable goes through as well. And you want to make sure there's no interference there. Now if you want to have your vertical tail removable, just set it up in a jig, make a mark where that 90 degree point is, where it's 90 degrees to the stab, and then use some secure stretchy tape, something light like Kapton tape or even electrical tape, and you can just put a couple wraps on and tape it on. That'll be fine. Since I'm not going to be really taking apart this plane very much, I decided just to go ahead and epoxy my rudder on. I used a 2-part epoxy JB weld, a really thin coat on there. Got it lined up. I had plenty of time to make adjustments while the epoxy was going off, and I got my vertical perfectly aligned to my elevator.